Right now, there is a massive discrepancy unfolding in the Middle East that completely redefines the geopolitical landscape. Before delving into the complexities of the current international standoff, it is essential to examine two conflicting statements that recently emerged. The vast chasm separating these two perspectives essentially dictates the true nature of this developing narrative. In the early hours of August 2nd, former United States President Donald Trump issued a declaration on his social media platform. He proclaimed that he had agreed to halt an impending military offensive contingent upon the swift finalization of a negotiated settlement. His message directed his team to immediately finalize the agreement. Conversely, during that exact same morning timeframe, the state-run news apparatus in Tehran presented a radically different reality. Official media outlets in the Islamic Republic reported absolutely no evidence suggesting their government had requested any cessation of hostilities. Furthermore, leadership within the country completely abstained from acknowledging that any diplomatic discussions were even occurring. Consider the sheer magnitude of that disconnect. The American leader openly broadcasted that a calculated armed intervention was being suspended because a diplomatic resolution was imminent. Meanwhile, the adversary supposedly participating in this proposed resolution flatly refused to validate its existence. Take a moment to fully process the implications of this scenario. The United States publicly relented, while the opposing power maintained absolute silence. This dynamic does not represent traditional statecraft. It certainly does not qualify as a mutual de-escalation of hostilities. Instead, for those analyzing the geopolitical chessboard, it stands as a glaring indication that the United States effectively handed a strategic triumph to its rival. They secured this unprecedented advantage without firing a single weapon. Once you grasp the underlying mechanics of this geopolitical maneuvering, your perspective on these late-night social media proclamations will permanently shift. In this analysis, we will deconstruct the current situation using distinct strategic frameworks and a specialized theory that conventional news outlets are entirely overlooking. By the conclusion of this breakdown, it will become unmistakably clear why calling off this specific military operation carries far more strategic weight than any kinetic barrage launched previously during this prolonged engagement. To properly contextualize this paradigm shift, you must simultaneously track two distinct occurrences that transpired within a tight chronological window. Mainstream broadcasters are presenting this timeline as a seamlessly woven, unified sequence of events leading toward peace. It is anything but unified. We are actually witnessing two contradictory geopolitical maneuvers aiming at entirely divergent objectives. The first major event unfolded during the evening hours of August 1st. The former American commander-in-chief issued a startling directive, abruptly canceling a massive wave of aerial bombardments. For several preceding days, high-level defense officials had been strategically leaking details of this impending operation to the press corps. The targeted assets were reportedly critical nodes within the adversary's lucrative energy production network. Defense analysts across multiple prestigious publications had characterized this planned offensive as potentially the most devastating and consequential escalation of the entire 5-month conflict. Yet suddenly, the operation was terminated. The announcement also claimed that Allied forces in the region had agreed to pause their kinetic activities. The entire reversal was presented to the public as a monumental breakthrough, accompanied by assertions that the foundational structure of a comprehensive peace treaty had been established. However, subsequent investigative reporting revealed a crucial detail regarding the origin of this diplomatic pivot. According to prominent broadcast networks, the primary catalyst for halting the bombers did not originate from the adversarial capital. Instead, the turning point was engineered in Riyadh. The highest echelons of Saudi Arabian leadership purportedly initiated direct contact with the American political figure, urging an immediate halt to the planned bombardment. The Saudis strongly cautioned against initiating a fresh cycle of destruction, fundamentally altering the trajectory of American military policy with a single conversation. This external intervention highlights a profound vulnerability in the current decision-making process, demonstrating how Allied economic anxieties can instantly override meticulously planned military strategies. The sudden halt left intelligence agencies and military commanders scrambling to adjust to the rapidly shifting geopolitical reality. Simultaneously, the second critical event was unfolding across the globe, painting a vastly different picture of this alleged diplomatic triumph. During the exact same crucial hours when Washington was celebrating a de-escalation, the top diplomat for the opposing power was engaged in an entirely different set of negotiations. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was not communicating with Western intermediaries or brokering compromises with American representatives. Instead, he was actively consulting with high-ranking government officials in Islamabad. This diplomatic outreach to Pakistan suggests strategic maneuvering on a regional level, rather than capitulation to Western demands. Furthermore, the official broadcasting channels within the Islamic Republic maintained absolute radio silence regarding any supposed truce. There were zero broadcasts mentioning a mutual ceasefire, zero articles discussing American diplomatic outreach, and absolutely zero confirmation that a bilateral agreement had been forged. In fact, the rhetoric emanating from Tehran in the preceding 24 hours directly contradicted the narrative of impending peace. A prominent security official, prominently featured by domestic news agencies, had publicly ridiculed Western reports detailing the impending infrastructure strikes. He dismissed the American operational plans as utter lunacy. Moreover, he explicitly warned that leadership had already finalized highly destructive contingency plans designed for immediate execution if attacked. These retaliatory protocols specifically targeted vital American and Allied energy assets scattered throughout the turbulent region. When you strip away the political spin and analyze the raw intelligence, a stark reality emerges. The leadership in Washington prematurely broadcasted a massive concession to the global public. Conversely, the leadership in Tehran offered absolutely nothing in return. The American administration frantically coordinated with its partners in Riyadh to mitigate economic fallout, while the opposing regime focused its diplomatic energy on solidifying regional alliances in Islamabad. Yet, the dominant international press corps irresponsibly amalgamated these disconnected, contradictory events into a triumphant, sanitized narrative of diplomatic progress. That journalistic interpretation is not merely flawed, it represents a complete inversion of geopolitical reality. The Western establishment media essentially manufactured a narrative of mutual stand-down when the observable evidence pointed toward unilateral American withdrawal. This fundamental misreading of the situation obscures the harsh truth of the standoff. By eagerly adopting a pacifying narrative, commentators ignored the blatant asymmetry in how both capitals reacted. One side loudly declared an end to hostilities to appease domestic and allied concerns, while the other side maintained a fiercely combative posture, completely unbothered by the sudden shift in American strategy. This dangerous miscalculation allows a hostile foreign power to secure a significant tactical victory while facing zero reciprocal obligations or operational constraints. Beyond the glaring diplomatic disconnect, there is a third, deeply concerning data point that the majority of mainstream analysis completely ignored. On the exact same day this purported ceasefire was loudly championed, maritime security agencies reported severe violence in the region's most critical maritime choke point. The British naval authorities officially documented that a commercial tanker had been physically attacked. Furthermore, an additional detonation occurred in dangerously close proximity to a second maritime vessel navigating through the highly contested Strait of Hormuz just off the Omani coastline. Therefore, while major news networks were busily updating their graphics to announce a looming peace treaty, the tangible reality on the water involved active explosions in the primary flashpoint of this entire geopolitical crisis. When two hostile nations are authentically engaged in a process of mutual de-escalation, they generally ensure that commercial shipping lanes remain free from explosive disruptions on the very evening the truce is publicized. While these maritime attacks do not conclusively prove deliberate sabotage by high-level leadership on either side, they unequivocally demonstrate that the operational environment is intensely volatile. The situation remains far more chaotic and deeply unresolved than any optimistic headline regarding a peace accord could possibly convey. To truly comprehend why Washington willingly surrendered its tactical advantage despite this obvious chaos, we must rely on a foundational analytical framework. We must turn to the ancient historian Thucydides. While analyzing classical Greek philosophy might seem unconventional for modern policy analysis, this exact paradigm has consistently illuminated the hidden drivers of this conflict when contemporary models failed. The insights provided by this historical lens demonstrate an undeniable durability. When Thucydides chronicled the brutal geopolitical struggles of his era over 2 millennia ago, he identified 3 primary motivations that govern the behavior of powerful nations. He theorized that regardless of the sophisticated justifications broadcasted to the public, grand strategy is ultimately dictated by fear, honor, and interest. If we apply these 3 timeless pillars to the sudden American cancellation of military action, the seemingly irrational political behavior immediately transforms into a predictable, highly calculated survival mechanism. The administration's abrupt reversal was not born out of newfound goodwill, but rather a harsh calculation based on these ancient principles. Let us systematically evaluate how each of these powerful forces exerted overwhelming pressure on the decision-making apparatus, ultimately forcing the most powerful military force on Earth to publicly stand down, before securing a single tangible concession from its primary regional adversary. By examining these forces, the hidden architecture of this strategic surrender becomes undeniable. We begin with the concept of fear. It is imperative to ask why a commanding executive would abruptly terminate a massive combat operation that his own defense apparatus had spent days carefully preparing. The cancellation did not occur because the adversarial regime suddenly ceased to pose a lethal threat. Rather, the decision was driven by the terrifying realization that sustained conflict was beginning to generate unsustainable political and economic liabilities, just as a critical domestic election cycle approached. The indicators of this mounting crisis were impossible to ignore. Global petroleum markets were reacting violently, threatening to destabilize the domestic economy. The confirmed maritime assault on a commercial vessel traversing the Strait of Hormuz, verified by British naval intelligence mere hours before the military pause, signaled impending chaos in international shipping. Furthermore, a deeply troubling digital infiltration targeted critical civic infrastructure in the state of Minnesota, an event so severe that it required direct public acknowledgement from the highest levels of government. Underlying all these immediate crises was the profound terror that launching a comprehensive aerial bombardment against lucrative foreign energy facilities would ignite an uncontrollable regional conflagration. This was the exact apocalyptic scenario that neighboring Saudi Arabian leadership frantically warned about during their urgent diplomatic intervention. This represents a paralyzing fear of disproportionate loss. It is the acute anxiety that escalating the confrontation will ultimately extract a heavier toll on the homeland than any potential strategic victory could justify. Moreover, there is an even deeper dimension to this fear that arguably eclipses the panic over fluctuating commodity prices. When a foreign conflict, initially defined by precision strikes on distant military outposts, suddenly sparks domestic headlines regarding compromised infrastructure on American soil, the fundamental political nature of the engagement transforms instantly. The narrative ceases to be a triumphant display of international dominance and rapidly devolves into a terrifying story about the failure to safeguard the domestic population. That specific vulnerability generates the exact type of political panic that compels a wartime administration to frantically search for any available avenue of retreat. They become desperate for an exit strategy, even if that resolution has not been formally negotiated or guaranteed by the opposition. In the classical framework of geopolitical strategy, this is the definitive manifestation of state-level fear overriding military ambition. This overwhelming dread of domestic backlash and economic catastrophe paralyzed the administration, proving that internal vulnerabilities often dictate the boundaries of foreign policy far more strictly than military capabilities ever could. The second pillar of our analytical framework is honor, and this is where the administration's public positioning becomes severely compromised. Just 24 hours prior to the abrupt military cancellation, a highly respected retired naval commander who previously oversaw regional central command operations publicly declared that the adversarial regime was facing imminent collapse. Simultaneously, top diplomatic officials loudly asserted that the opposing government was finally dealing with a radically uncompromising American leadership. This is the distinct vocabulary of absolute supremacy. It represents the confident rhetoric of an administration that had utilized the previous 5 months to carefully construct a narrative guaranteeing ultimate victory. However, within a single day of broadcasting those aggressive proclamations, that very same administration announced it was abandoning its own highly anticipated offensive maneuvers. The contradiction here is glaring and politically disastrous. A government cannot convince its citizenry that an enemy is on the brink of total defeat, only to abruptly cancel a decisive military strike the very next day simply because a foreign monarch requested restraint. That scenario illustrates national honor shattering against harsh geopolitical reality. When such a severe collision occurs between projected strength and actual policy, political leaders inevitably resort to specific diplomatic maneuvers that experts have thoroughly documented. We will explore those specific tactics shortly. The third and final pillar is interest. Throughout this protracted standoff, leadership has been surprisingly transparent regarding the staggering economic and political burdens the conflict has generated. The Defense Department has already conceded that continuous deployments in the contested theater have resulted in billions of dollars in unexpected budgetary overruns. The military has suffered tangible equipment losses over 5 months of sustained hostility. Furthermore, an extensive maritime interdiction campaign has yielded alarming statistics. According to official military data released just prior to the de-escalation, the ongoing naval blockade had forced the rerouting of 30 commercial cargo ships, completely crippled 2 vessels, and necessitated the forceful boarding of 2 others. Such massive logistical interference sends immediate shockwaves through global maritime insurance markets, which inevitably translates to surging fuel costs for American consumers. The calculus of national interest dictates that a prolonged conflict is becoming financially ruinous. With crucial elections looming, securing a headline claiming the restoration of peace is exponentially more valuable to a political campaign than broadcasting the successful destruction of foreign power grids. Honor, fear, and interest all dictated an immediate withdrawal. Consequently, the administration chose to broadcast a dramatic retreat, desperately attempting to claim credit for a diplomatic breakthrough that the opposing regime had not actually authorized or acknowledged. This strategic retreat introduces a highly sophisticated tactical concept that nearly all mainstream political commentators have completely failed to identify. I refer to this dynamic as the vacuum strategy. The fundamental logic underlying this maneuver is incredibly effective. Whenever one faction in a bitter international dispute broadcasts a massive, unsolicited concession, and the opposing faction responds with absolute, resolute silence, the conventional media interpretation is deeply flawed. Standard political analysts typically assume the quiet party is merely exercising caution, suffering from bureaucratic delays, or managing internal divisions. That is the generous, optimistic interpretation. The far more ruthless and highly accurate assessment is entirely different. In this high-stakes environment, strategic silence does not indicate weakness or hesitation. Rather, silence functions as a powerful weapon of leverage. Analyze the tangible impact of the American executive's late-night social media broadcast. That singular message publicly locked the United States into a definitive stance before its own electorate, its international allies, and highly volatile financial markets. It cemented the narrative that a diplomatic resolution was imminent and mutually desired. Crucially, this unilateral declaration shifted the entire burden of proof squarely onto American shoulders. Washington was suddenly forced to produce a finalized treaty rapidly, or risk appearing foolish and deceptive to its own voting public. The adversarial regime was not required to utter a single syllable to reap the massive benefits of this dynamic. Every single hour that the opposing capital maintains its silence is another hour where the crushing weight of political expectation rests entirely on the American administration. Every passing day that yields no official confirmation from the adversary is a day where the American leadership's credibility rapidly evaporates. This is the essence of the vacuum strategy. A combatant does not need to formally surrender any leverage if their opponent's own desperate public declarations are already inflicting maximum political damage. The opposing regime did not beg for a cessation of airstrikes. They simply did not have to. The American command structure voluntarily handed them a massive operational reprieve, packaged it as a monumental diplomatic victory, and broadcasted it to the globe completely free of charge. By willingly stepping into this trap, Washington allowed its adversary to dictate the pace of the narrative without committing to a single diplomatic concession, essentially fighting a war of attrition through sheer silence. This masterclass in passive aggression paralyzes the American diplomatic apparatus, trapping them in a self-made crisis where demanding action only further highlights their profound lack of control. To transform this theoretical framework into a concrete reality, we must examine the specific numerical data that defines this crisis. Consider the figures 32 and 2. These digits represent the official maritime casualty statistics compiled by American Military Command during a recent operational assessment of the naval blockade. 30 global commercial transporters were forced to alter their navigational routes. 2 massive vessels were entirely incapacitated, while an additional 2 were physically intercepted and inspected by hostile forces. Each of these incidents serves as a critical distress signal within the international shipping and insurance sectors. These global financial markets do not possess the patience to wait for a geopolitical standoff to politely resolve itself. As this instability drags on week after week, insurance conglomerates drastically increase premiums for vessels entering the contested waterways. Major logistics corporations permanently abandon the region, and a significant portion of that lucrative maritime traffic will never return, regardless of whether the military conflict officially terminates. The next critical number is 5. This represents the 5 grueling months that have elapsed since late February, when the American administration boldly announced the commencement of overwhelming combat operations against the adversary. Half a year of continuous military engagement, which itself followed a brief series of kinetic strikes earlier in the spring, has yielded remarkably little. Despite this immense projection of power, Washington has completely failed to secure the unconditional capitulation or the ironclad treaty it initially promised the public. This is no longer a rapid, overwhelming tactical victory. It has devolved into an endless, grinding engagement. These protracted entanglements are precisely the type of conflicts that destroy a government's domestic political support far more rapidly than they degrade the enemy's will to fight. The most alarming number, however, is 0. That represents the exact number of official statements released by the opposing regime, confirming that any diplomatic agreement is actually nearing completion. There have been 0 formal acknowledgments of the American ceasefire narrative. State-sponsored media has offered 0 indication that their government requested any relief. There has been absolute 0 deviation from their aggressive stance regarding the vital maritime choke points. Finally, consider the number 1. A single diplomatic phone call from a third-party nation reportedly orchestrated this entire military reversal. This solitary conversation between Washington and Saudi leadership halted an unprecedented bombing campaign. These figures definitively prove that the silent adversary currently dominates the strategic negotiating table. These statistics clearly illustrate the imbalance of power, leading us directly to our second analytical model. This concept provides the most accurate explanation for why the American executive executed this bizarre maneuver. It is known in academic circles as the theory of audience costs, originally pioneered by international relations scholar James Fearon. The foundational premise is remarkably straightforward yet undeniably potent. When a head of state issues a dramatic threat or makes a rigid promise before their domestic citizenry, they intentionally manufacture a severe political penalty for themselves if they subsequently fail to execute that pledge. Fearon postulated that this dynamic explains why televised public ultimatums are often perceived as far more dangerous than classified back-channel warnings. Retreating from a public declaration inflicts devastating political damage, resulting in public humiliation, shattered authority, and the permanent erosion of diplomatic credibility. Seasoned statesmen understand this mechanism intuitively, which is precisely why they meticulously avoid issuing absolute guarantees they cannot independently fulfill. Viewed through this academic lens, the administration's actions on the 1st of August become deeply alarming. The executive did not quietly suspend the military operation through clandestine intelligence networks. He did not allow the story to anonymously filter through the press and slowly dissipate. Instead, he personally broadcasted the retreat to the entire world, explicitly demanding that a comprehensive treaty be finalized immediately. By executing this maneuver, he voluntarily weaponized the theory of audience costs against his own administration. He explicitly promised his political base and the broader electorate that a historic diplomatic victory was imminent, guaranteeing that any failure to deliver would be viewed as a catastrophic betrayal. Why would a sitting leader willingly orchestrate such a massive political vulnerability? The theoretical framework provides a chilling answer. Occasionally, governments intentionally absorb these immense domestic risks to project absolute conviction to their enemies, signaling that they are fully committed to a specific course of action. However, this high-stakes gamble only succeeds if the opposing nation formally reciprocates. Because the adversary has maintained absolute silence, the American leader has absorbed 100% of the domestic political peril, while the opposing regime has accepted absolutely 0 obligation to compromise. Under this strategic model, the administration has maneuvered itself into the most disadvantageous position imaginable, handcuffed to a public promise, while the enemy watches their political capital burn. This self-inflicted diplomatic crisis deepens significantly with every single passing hour. Before finalizing this strategic assessment, it is essential to rigorously evaluate the strongest possible counterargument. Presenting a comprehensive analysis requires examining the most charitable interpretation of the administration's unconventional tactics. The primary defense of this abrupt cancellation suggests that publicly broadcasting a rapidly approaching deadline is actually a sophisticated psychological weapon directed at the adversary rather than an unforced error. According to this optimistic perspective, by explicitly demanding an immediate resolution, the American leadership is gambling that the opposing government is equally desperate for an escape route. After enduring months of crippling economic sanctions and devastated infrastructure, the adversary might secretly desire a cessation of hostilities. Proponents of this theory argue that a boisterous American proclamation provides the opposing negotiators with the necessary domestic political cover to accept a treaty without appearing subservient. In this highly specific scenario, the lack of immediate confirmation from their capital is not a calculated power play. Instead, it is merely the sluggish, bureaucratic response of a rigid, autocratic government struggling to process a sudden shift in American foreign policy. Furthermore, Saudi Arabia's direct involvement implies this de-escalation enjoys robust regional backing rather than being an isolated act of American desperation. While this defense is intellectually sound, it completely collapses when confronted with the observable facts on the ground. First, the opposing state media network is not simply processing information slowly, it is deliberately propagating a hostile narrative. Their official reports aggressively reiterate that their uncompromising demands regarding maritime dominance remain entirely unchanged. This is a highly calculated editorial mandate designed to reassure their domestic hardliners that no surrender is imminent. If their leadership truly wanted to prepare the public for a compromise, state broadcasters would be gradually softening their rhetoric, not fiercely doubling down on their most aggressive ultimatums. Second, consider the timing of their hostile rhetoric. Shortly before the withdrawal, adversarial generals threatened massive strikes against Allied energy grids. This is the behavior of a military apparatus fully prepared to escalate the conflict, not a desperate regime begging for a truce. When aggressive state propaganda is combined with immediate threats of devastating retaliation, the resulting picture absolutely obliterates the illusion of a mutual ceasefire. We are witnessing a unilateral withdrawal fully disguised as a mutual victory, while the enemy concedes absolutely nothing. Moving forward, there are 4 specific indicators you must actively monitor over the next 72 hours to determine the true trajectory of this geopolitical standoff. Initially, scrutinize the international wires for any official communique emanating from the adversarial foreign ministry. If their top diplomats issue even a vaguely worded acknowledgement that bilateral negotiations have commenced, the dynamic instantly changes. The moment they publicly validate the American narrative, they surrender their leverage, signaling a willingness to actually finalize an agreement rather than silently absorbing American concessions. Until that exact moment occurs, the silent strategy remains fully operational. Secondly, closely analyze the commercial transit data originating from the heavily fortified maritime corridors. If the terrifying statistic of 30 redirected cargo vessels begins a rapid, verifiable decline, that operational shift will serve as undeniable proof that tensions are genuinely decreasing. However, if insurance premiums and rerouting figures remain static, the blockade is still aggressively enforced, regardless of any optimistic diplomatic announcements published online. Thirdly, pay close attention to the diplomatic maneuvers executed by the Saudi monarchy. Since regional leadership originally pressured the American executive to halt the bombers, their subsequent actions are highly revealing. If Riyadh launches a highly visible, coordinated diplomatic offensive directed at the opposing capital, it suggests a legitimate regional peace framework is materializing. Conversely, if the Saudis retreat into silence, this entire episode was merely an isolated panic response, not a comprehensive master plan. Finally, carefully observe the precise vocabulary utilized by the American leader during his upcoming press engagements. If his rhetoric subtly transitions from promising an immediate resolution to deploying ambiguous phrases regarding constructive dialogue or gradual progress, the original narrative is unraveling. Politicians virtually never explicitly admit that a prominent geopolitical deadline has expired. Instead, they quietly eliminate the definitive terminology that established their impossible promises. Watch for the sudden disappearance of the word rapid from his public speeches. That glaring omission signals utter defeat. The massive political audience cost has finally arrived in full force. As we conclude, I urge you to reflect on a fundamental principle of international statecraft. Within elite diplomatic circles, absolute silence from a hostile nation is widely considered the most terrifying response possible. Overt threats are manageable because they clearly communicate the adversary's demands and boundaries. Complete silence, however, provides zero actionable intelligence, forcing anxious governments to project their own optimistic delusions onto the diplomatic void. Currently, Washington is desperately filling that terrifying void with visions of a comprehensive treaty. The opposing regime has not uttered a single word to validate that hallucination. Historical precedent paints a remarkably grim picture for administrations that attempt to publicly negotiate against a completely silent adversary. Therefore, consider this critical question over the coming days. If the opposing government absolutely refuses to ever acknowledge this proposed agreement, what are the remaining options for the United States? The administration must either reverse its own highly publicized cancellation and launch the delayed bombers, thereby appearing chronically indecisive, or meekly accept the silence as the new geopolitical baseline, hoping the electorate ignores the humiliation. The classical historians would easily predict the ultimate outcome of this disastrous paradigm. They understood that global superpowers rarely crumble due to one spectacular military defeat on the battlefield. Instead, hegemony steadily evaporates during these precise moments of unforced diplomatic error. It dissolves when a commander-in-chief manufactures unachievable public guarantees, while the enemy astutely realizes that remaining utterly silent costs them nothing. Meanwhile, the American credibility clock publicly expires for the entire world to witness. This strategic collapse does not require any further kinetic military action. It only requires Washington to continue speaking while their rival patiently waits. The true victor is obvious.